right, Pastor Steve, you can go ahead.
Yeah, what we have been doing since we started this series is to actually account for the black radical tradition in South Africa, because we believe that given the history of this country, it would be quite amazing that today we are unable to engage in any kind of conversation or discourse, in which the black radical paradigm, is not actually setting the agenda. So part of what we have been trying to do is to account for the making and the unmaking of the black radical tradition in South Africa in the 20th century. In our last episode, we were focusing on the 20 years between the First World War and the Second World War. And part of what we have to come out with, out of that presentation, was the fact that that period, the 20 years between 19 and 39, would have been the first historical moment of the articulation of the black radical tradition in 20th century history of resistance in South Africa. The one thing that we really need to emphasize at this stage is that the entire movement itself, from 1919 to 39, although it would have been made up of, fragmented groups, which were not particularly coordinated, but each of these groups would have been influenced, to a certain extent by the Garveyite tradition that came out of, the African American communities in the US. There are organizational, links that were established, organizational and ideological links, that were established between the mass movement of African American people in the US and Africans in South Africa and other parts of the African continent, particularly during this period. So in some instances, the Wellingtonian movement during this period is spoken about as a chapter of the Garveyite movement. What is important about this is to try and see how the ideology, of the Garveyite movement gets to be transmitted into later forms of struggles, such as the struggles of the 1940s and the struggles of the 1950s. The reason why it is important to do this is because these are moments of liberation struggle history, which out of malice, have actually been taken out of the historical narrative. But this is because they are precisely expressions of the black radical tradition that they have been taken out of all historical accounts. So that by the time we get to the 1950s, we are being made to forget that part of the demand of the 1950s was a return of the land. So the struggle at that point is a struggle for the right to territory. That is what the struggle is about. And that was the struggle of the 20 years between 1919 and 1939. But that connection is not actually made precisely because in South African historiography, that moment has been completely deleted, out of all historical accounts. It has been deliberately neglected. And it is only thanks to, some American historians who, on studying Garvey, realized that his impact went far beyond the US and actually impacted some of the anti-colonial movements on the African continent, but particularly in South Africa, where the Garveyite movement was particularly significant. So going into the 1950s, we are made to forget completely, how the movement of the 1920s would have impacted, just in terms of the construction of the popular ideology of the 1950s, that a great deal of it would have been the legacy of the 1920s mass movement. But we are unable to think through this precisely because it is a moment in history, which was deliberately and maliciously either underplayed or completely blotted out. But then I did touch on the entire decade of the 1950s. And my assertion to this day is that to the extent that the ANC was a mass movement in the 1950s, it was because at that time there were Africanists inside the ANC. And it is my assertion here that it is on account of the Africanists that the masses would have responded the way they did, to ANC campaigns. But I have singled out each one of the 1950s campaigns. And in spite of the popular rhetoric about the Defiance campaign having been a popular movement, I have demonstrated the ways in which the Africanists themselves inside the ANC were quite unhappy about the fact that it was an agenda that was being set by other people other than the Africanists. So there is a measure of romanticization of the Defiance campaign as a kind of mass movement. But looking at it pretty closely, the Defiance campaign was nothing more than a passive resistance response, which is pretty much what Gandhi was all about. And all the other campaigns of the 1950s, I singled out each one of them. The Bantu education campaign, the campaign against the destruction of Sophiatown, the adoption of the Freedom Charter. All of these are meant to substantiate the claim that, to some extent the ANC was a mass movement. But we have demonstrated that there is a counter-narrative to explain particularly those campaigns and the extent to which they were alienated from the masses, which is why each one of them collapsed in the ways that they did. But then we also explained that because of the affinity, maybe the kind of, closer relationship that Africanists in the ANC had with the masses, once they moved and formed the PAC, they were able to mobilize the masses into the anti-PAC campaign of 1960, which culminated in the Sharpeville massacre. The point here is that we have to be able to reflect on that earlier period of the first half of the 20th century and come to understand, what legacies of those movements were being transmitted into the movement of the 1970s. And what is the movement of the 1970s? It is the Black consciousness movement inspired by Steve Biko's, kind of thinking, ideas and philosophy. And this is opportune, to reflect on Black consciousness in those broad terms. What this enables us to do is to have a clearer sense of what Black consciousness was about. The whole thing of restricting its emergence to the 1970s without actually understanding that, there is a continuity, in the character of the mass movements of the first half of the 20th century and a continuity into the second half. The ways in which the first half of the century would have influenced, the movement in the 1970s. But the other thing that we need to assert here, and we are asserting, is that the mass movement of the 1970s actually represent the final articulation of the Black radical tradition and the Black radical paradigm in the mass movement, of the 20th century.
Do you mind if I...
we assert that Black Wednesday marked the final episode in the unfolding Black radical expressions of the 20th century. And we shall come back to, Black Wednesday and Steve Biko, because Ntatemlora wants to raise a question.
Yes, in regards to the 1950s, your focus had been entirely upon the ANC and really critiquing, ANC, mainstream ANC-backed campaigns. What importance would you attribute to the Alexander bus boycott? What kind of politics attend that movement? Who does the Alexander bus boycott belong to? And could it be said to be some kind of prologue to the Sharpeville?
Yes. Actually, it is not only, and this is an interesting question, it is not only the Alexander bus boycott, which actually can be used as a test to measure the extent to which the ANC would have been responsive to and, rooted within the masses. Let us mention a number of these that were almost, that shared a character with the Alexander bus boycott, because that also has, brings about a very interesting dynamic of this period. Part of what happens here is that in the first 12 years of apartheid, one does get the kinds of responses, not only in Alex, but in other parts of South African urban centers. You had the same kind of situation in Port Elizabeth and in East London as well, but also in Everton. So what we are looking at here is actually the Everton bus boycott, Alexander bus boycott, the bus boycotts in Port Elizabeth, as well as in East London. Now, all of these constitute a moment in the history of resistance, and that moment is, popular unrest in the first 12 years of apartheid. I'm actually here referring to an article that was actually written by me, and I think the viewers will have an opportunity. It's a very short article, in which I'm actually explaining the relationship, between these protests that took place in the 4 areas and the ANC. And I'm actually demonstrating that these, were moments in which communities were actually involved, in the execution of these campaigns. No doubt, some of the ANC leaders at the time, would actually become involved. But here is an interesting, point to make here. All of those leaders that became involved in the popular protest of 1948 to 1960 actually ended up being the members of the PAC. So they were Africanists inside the ANC, and they inspired their own communities, to get involved in that mass movement of 48 to 60. Some of the notable, characters that came out of that would actually be Tennyson Makiwane himself, who led the Alexander bus boycott, and for that he was actually, taken into custody. And you also had David Sibeko, who was leading the campaign, the Everton bus boycott. And David Sibeko also became a very prominent member of the PAC. But these were Africanists inside the ANC before 1959, before the formation of the PAC. So this is an unpopular view to actually express, because academic history has actually characterized the ANC as becoming a mass movement in the 1950s. Yes, we can concede to that. But the one thing that we begin to observe is that there is a kind of a reaction on the part of Africanists inside the ANC. There can be no doubt, that by 1951, there is that distinct division within the ANC, between the Africanists and, those that would actually become the radicals of, of the Marxist-Leninist tradition. And that kind of distinction is carried through until 1953, when the Congress Alliance is established. And once the Congress Alliance is established, the Africanists inside the ANC are becoming progressively alienated from the mainstream organization. And one can see by the kinds of campaigns that were being undertaken, the anti-Sophiatown campaign, the Freedom Charter, all of these are campaigns that Africanists would have been quite, uncomfortable investing in. And so because of that and because of their links to the masses, those campaigns actually collapsed.
I've been urging that the focus really is on Biko.
Yes,
all of this feeds into Biko.
Yes,
To
yes.
please kind of centralize Biko, the personage and his impact
Yes.
upon black society and resistance.
Yes, and this is important. This is important because, in the entire retelling of Biko, and I often say, when the opportunity, when the 12th of September comes along, it becomes an opportunity to start inscribing new messages on Biko's dead body. Now, here is another opportunity to start inscribing new messages on Steve Biko's dead body. The issue here is that the 1950s are particularly important in the ways in which they shaped Biko himself. The one detail that is actually being thrown around without being explored fully is actually Biko's connection to POQO. And this has to be made explicit.
Yes.
POQO is no doubt, the mass movement of the 50s and 60s. But in 1964-65, POQO gets involved in a major uprising. And this uprising is particularly concentrated in the Eastern Cape. And this is an uprising that takes place over an extended period of time. But Biko is in the Eastern Cape at this time. So all of this are happening, at the time Biko grows up as a teenager. And, in 1962, he's about 16 years old. In 1964, Biko and Kaya are known to have been, Kaya is Biko's elder brother. They are known to have been taken into custody on suspicion of being POQO operatives. Now, this is a detail, a fact that is only being thrown around, and it is not being explored. What needs to be explored is the character of the POQO uprising of 1964 to 65. And once we understand that, we can then begin to understand how someone like Biko and his elder brother Kaya would have been involved or even suspected, of being POQO operatives. POQO operated in small units, small units that were secret, or it was a secret organization, if you like. So because of the secrecy around the organization of POQO and some of its campaigns, it tended to be a closed book to the security establishment. And that would have heightened their anxiety over what POQO would do. And no doubt, all of this, came to pass. If you think about the attacks that POQO actually organized, for instance, the one at Bashir River, that was planned. It was a planned attack on a group of white people. The idea being to spread terror. But this is an attack that was planned by a very small unit. And by the time it was carried out, it was, almost choreographed. And it was clear to the security police that this thing was actually planned. That family of white people and the family friend were killed mainly because they were whites. But the idea here was, to begin to project POQO as a kind of, armed formation that is not going to hesitate to resort to violent measures, to make their point. Now, Biko is actually being thrust, into that situation. And he's actually been taken into custody on suspicion that he was a POQO operative. Black radicals are afraid, to explore that relationship. No doubt, perhaps, the evidence may still be a little sketchy, but a bit of legwork, can actually begin to unearth a great deal more evidence, which might actually substantiate a very conscious decision, on Biko and Kaya's part to participate in that movement. But also that also begins to explain, the white supremacy state's attitude, not only to POQO but to the PAC as well. This idea that Africanists are constituted in such a way that it is almost impossible to infiltrate them. that would have heightened, the state's fear of such organizations. And the PAC and POQO fall in
specifically a
that
swart
category.
gevaar is what you want.
That in fact is, the explanation of the swart gevaar. And that becomes a kind of mindset, that the white supremacy state actually adopt. But it is not only the security apparatus, which has a sense of fear and foreboding in relation to POQO and the PAC. It is white society, in general, because this actually generates a great deal of fear. And we will see how this actually plays itself out in the mass movement of the 1970s. The mass movement that was inspired by the Black consciousness, philosophy and the Black consciousness movement.
To be sure, the POQO uprising was a direct reaction to the brutality of the apartheid state. The apartheid state at Sharpeville, Maxa. Yeah.
Just a second, I just need to change my...
Oh, can continue. Okay, yes.
Yes, this relationship between Biko and POQO and the PAC, it has to be, emphasized here. This is a question that often comes up, both in terms of the Black consciousness philosophy as an instrument of mass mobilization, and how it relates to the the Pan-Africanist doctrine, of the PAC. And but my sense here is that the reason why we are unable to really unpack this complex relationship, between the Pan-Africanist movement and the Black consciousness movement has to do precisely, with the determination to do to the Black radical tradition what is being done to it at all times, to misinterpret it, to minimize it, and to misdiagnose it deliberately. And if there is a connection that can be made between POQO and Biko, there's going to be a great deal of investment going into masking, hiding, or obliterating any traces of that connection. And this has actually happened over history. Again, this relationship came to a test soon after the 1976 uprising, when there was a predisposition to actually condemn the exiled movement, both the ANC and the PAC, as having slumped into a paralysis. But there was a certain partiality towards the PAC, where there were people who would say, but the PAC can still be salvaged, in a sense. So this issue has actually been a burning issue, but there has never been any very serious work that was done theoretically, to establish this relationship, between, Biko and Sobukwe, if you like, or between the Black consciousness movement and the Pan-Africanist Congress. And what this series has done, by actually going back to the early forms of Black radicalism and showing how those early forms of Black radicalism were transmitted throughout the century, that helps in establishing that link. So the link does not actually begin with the establishment of the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1958. The ideological foundation of Black radical tradition is established very early in the century, and the character that it takes, is actually being mimicked, if you like, from the mass movement of African American people in the US led by Marcus Garvey. What am I talking about? What I'm actually saying is that the Black radical tradition is a thread. It is a thread that can be traced from 1918 with the advent of Garveyism in South Africa to 1977 on the occasion of Black Wednesday, because that would actually mark the end of the Black radical tradition as an instrument of mass mobilization, also as also as an usable instrument in intellectual and philosophical discourses, about the black radical tradition. That is my assertion. My assertion is that in that 60-year period of the 20th century, what one is looking at is in fact an unbreakable thread of the black radical tradition, which actually gets accentuated in the 1970s.
Just a qualification, if
Yes.
I may. To be sure, Vincent suggests, Robert Vincent suggests that the Gaviite movement was merely the second phase of the Africa for the Africans movement. The first of which would have been the Ethiopianist movement in the latter part of the 19th century. There had been a suggestion of that, and so I'm just
Yes,
a notification, Sam, just in the interest of.
But also Vincent would agree that the Ethiopianism of the, in fact, it would be the Ethiopianism of the last quarter of the 19th century. Often it is actually being seen as emerging in 1875 and thereabouts. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there is no doubt that the movements of the interwar period of the 1920s and the 1930s are also inspired ideologically by the Ethiopianism, and they are also rooted within independent churches. There is no doubt that Amma Israeli can actually be characterized as being an Ethiopian kind of tradition, or Christian tradition, if you like. Prophetess Nonteta, the same can be said of the Wellingtonian movement itself, was also based on the Ethiopian, thinking. Unless, of course, there would be, certain deviations that you may want to point out to.
No, that I'm just keen that we draw our attention to Biko, specifically the circumstances around his death.
Yes.
And you see,
yes.
I mean, lately, you and I listened to our esteemed brother Andile Mngitama suggesting, that Biko embarked upon the trip to Western Cape.
Yes.
I don't know.
I think that should actually constitute the last part of this, because what then becomes important is that it is established, Biko's philosophy, Biko's black consciousness philosophy actually inspired the mass movement of the 1970s. Now, this is what we really need, the viewers to understand, that just in terms of explaining the broad history of the 1970s, we see that as a movement. We know it is contested. We know that, for political ascendancy, it is a movement that is contested by political parties, the ANC, the PAC, and the Black Consciousness Movement. But we want to go above those contestations and actually get to how the movement was actually constituted.
Yes.
And what is also important is that once the movement begins to play itself out, and being inspired by the black consciousness philosophy, we have to be able to establish the relationship between the mass movement itself and the black consciousness philosophy. And the one place that gives us an opportunity, to examine that is the Soweto uprising of 1976. So we have to be able to demonstrate, particularly to the younger generation. I don't think this has been done enough. We seem to think we have been able to do this, but there hasn't been any theoretical explanation of the relationship between black consciousness as a philosophy and the uprising of 1976-77. And this is what, and here I dare say, that just as an academic exercise, this is what you and me have actually been engaging in, attempting to show that black consciousness philosophy is a set of ideas. But if it is going to translate into political action, it has to find a space, where this is going to, where it is going to find expression. And such a space is provided by Soweto. Now, when we say such a space is provided by Soweto, it is an oversimplification of a very complex historical process. Because what actually makes Soweto to be responsive to black consciousness philosophy is historical experience. But if we can identify, if we can be able to isolate that historical experience and explain it, we will find other black townships in the PWV area, which is today Gauteng, that share similar traits with Soweto. Tsakani in Brakpan, Kwatema in Springs, Katlehong in Germiston, and Mohlakeng in Randfontein. All of these, and even Sharpeville in the Vaal, they share the same historical experiences as Soweto. So the point here is that that outbreak could have happened anywhere. It could have happened in Kwatema. Why? Because the ingredients for that to have happened would have been there in Kwatema as much as they were there in Soweto. Now, what this actually deals with is this whole phobia about the Soweto essentialism. It is a misplaced, kind of phobia that people have. People have to understand that what was at work in 1976 and 77 was the outburst of what in historical terms is actually the old location culture. It was the old location culture confronting white supremacy, in the ways in which it understood white supremacy from the 1920s into the 30s, into the 1940s, with Siyawugubha Siyawugebhula Umhlaba kaMasipala and the Mpanza mass movement, into the 1950s with the Africanists inside the ANC, and then into the 1970s. This is the unbreakable thread of black radicalism, which for reasons that we well understand, has been obfuscated in the creation of the historical narrative.
So in effect, what you are saying is that Biko's death, this theme of Biko's death, that rather it is a social resonance. You see what I'm saying? It is his resonance. It is Biko within us, the black collectivity that stands out, rather than Biko, the isolated personage, the isolated genius, if you will. He's been projected nowadays as a philosopher, some kind of philosopher king. You were saying that
yes. Black Wednesday is not the day that Biko died, but Black Wednesday also represents in very graphic ways the death of Biko the idea. Right. In terms of the organizational infrastructure that was created out of Biko's ideas, Black Wednesday represents the death of that organizational framework. Yes. So yes, what we are talking about here is not the death of Biko the person. And now that we have accounted for the impact of Biko's thinking and philosophy on the mass movement of the 1970s, we can then get into 1977 and Biko's actual death. Indeed. But I do think that Biko's actual death is a theme that has been covered quite extensively. And this may well have to do with a certain kind of uneasiness on the part of the white supremacist state. And what is it that the white supremacist state was particularly concerned about at this stage? It doesn't make sense to look at Biko's death in the context of the 12th of September alone and isolate that day alone. The previous 3 months leading to Biko's execution, because this is what it was. The black radical tradition was actually taking form and demonstrating a kind of resilience, that was particularly concerning to the white supremacist state and their security infrastructure. The unrest in Soweto was not ending by any long shot. It wasn't ending. And at this stage, there was a measure of desperation on the part of, the securocrats to really contain this thing for once and for all. It didn't have anything to do with an increased, kind of volume of infiltration, cross-border infiltration during this period. And if you think about it, between the 13th of December of June, when Solomon Masango and the Koch Street shooting thing happened. And Silverton in 1980, pretty little happened in terms of, cross-border insurgency, and that is documented. Very little happens. So it cannot have been, because of that the apartheid state securocrats were becoming, more anxious and more determined, to deal with the unrest. It was what, in fact, was happening in Soweto and beginning to spread, to other parts of the country. And they had to, come down hard. And what happened actually would have started on the 1st of September, when the state very robustly, intervened in the management of black schools. And that became a very critical, aspect of repression.
1st September 76, 77?
1st of September 1977.
Yes.
That was the beginning. And why take over the black, high schools? We explained earlier that there were three sides of unrest. It was the universities, it was the high schools, and it was the workplace. And these are the three sides that the state had to deal with to contain the mass movement of the 70s. So the crackdown on black high schools was in fact to counter any kind of unrest that may actually arise from the high schools. And if you think about it, it is the high schools that kept the momentum going. You would have the 4th of August and the state would come down hard on it. But it is in the high schools that a momentum would be regained and the mass movement would then go on. So the 1st of September is very significant, in that sense. And the 12th of September, no doubt that, this is, because, Biko actually was daring the securocrats. No, and this is something that we really need to talk about, because there has been so many explanations of why Biko needed to go, to Cape Town at this stage. And I think, we need to remind, the viewers here that by now, people inside the country were beginning to get a sense, of what the exiled movement was about and what their relative capacities would have been. Already we were beginning to have conversations about the ANC and about the PAC. And the fact that Biko undertook a trip, from King Williamstown to Cape Town, that in itself, is something that we may think or we may welcome if the idea was really to, spread the influence of black consciousness in the Western Cape. Because if you think about it, even though the black consciousness movement was a nationwide movement, the Western Cape tended to be, having other political formations. And these political formations were suspicious of the black consciousness movement.
As well as the Eng.
Pardon?
As well as the Eng.
As
well as the Eng.
As well as the Eng would have been suspicious. But, the non-European unity movement, for instance, would have had the view that the black consciousness movement is in fact a kind of a reactionary movement. So this is the situation that we had in the Western Cape. And if Biko was going to, try and entrench or actually establish BCM's footprints in the Western Cape, that may well have been welcomed. What is unacceptable and what would be unacceptable, to black radicals is that in September 1977, Biko is undertaking a trip to Cape Town, as others would claim, to try and establish a connection between the black consciousness movement or himself and the ANC. And the assumption here is that he probably wanted to make the BCM part of the ANC. Now, whether he wanted to make the BCM part of the ANC or whether he wanted to join the ANC, what that would reflect is Biko's naivete, I think would be, the right term to use here. And probably the fact that he wasn't privy to the kinds of conversations that would have been going on in Soweto and other parts of the country, during this period. It is in September, a year earlier, exactly a year earlier, that the Weekend World actually published an exclusive interview that Dumandlovu did with Tsietsi Mashinini. And in that interview, Tsietsi Mashinini, having come into contact with ANC people in Botswana, clearly stated that the ANC was defunct and that the PAC was dead. Now, we haven't talked about this much, because of fear in some instances, but in other instances, maybe because, it is a view that has been easily dismissed. But the reality is that it was true. It was true that the ANC in 1976 was actually defunct, and that very little was known of what the PAC would have been doing at the time. The interesting thing here is that within 2 years of Tsietsi having said this, just to indicate that this criticism of the ANC by Tsietsi Mashinini in 1976 was not far off the mark. The same kind of criticism comes out of the ANC itself. And here it is actually being made by a very prominent member and stalwart of the ANC, Tennyson Makiwane himself. Tennyson Makiwane is the same man who led the Alexander bus boycott. And he did, stay inside the ANC, in spite of the fact that he was an Africanist, a hardcore Africanist. Tennyson Makiwane came out in 1976, repeating precisely what Tsietsi had actually said. But Tennyson Makiwane went a little further. He was actually providing, a great deal of evidence that was illustrating the issues that he was actually raising with the ANC. So in a sense, Mashinini was actually vindicated by someone inside the ANC. The unfortunate thing, in fact, just to demonstrate to you how influential Makiwane was, on account of him having come out like that and criticized the ANC, and in particular Oliver Tambo, in the terms and ways that he did, Makiwane then went to the Transkei. That is an explanation that I give elsewhere in my writings as to why that happened. But Tambo actually follows him to the Transkei. And an assassin was sent to Transkei to actually eliminate Makiwane, and that's how he was gotten rid of. The issue here is that that very issue is raised again within the ANC or the Congress Alliance by Paul Trewiller in the Daily Maverick, in a number of articles that Paul Trewiller actually wrote. He reiterates what Makiwane had been saying in 1978, also validating and vindicating Mashinini's criticism of the ANC. Now back to Biko. Biko was not aware of all these developments.
Do you think so?
So if he was aware of these developments, it may well be because he wasn't aware of the impact.
Isn't it? This was widespread. I mean, at least. I mean, it is not likely that Biko would not have been aware of these aspects here. Isn't it likely that Biko was in fact attempting to get the ANC to join the Black consciousness movement rather than the other way around, given the dynamics at that conjunction, the political dynamics?
That is a position, no doubt. That is a position preferable to us. That is a position that would be preferable to the Black radical tradition.
I don't know.
Yes, I really want to respond to, I think it's certainly a valid question. In this narrative about Biko going to Cape Town and meeting with Neville Alexander, the claim is that he wanted to, establish a link with the ANC, and that is how it is being explained. What form this link is going to take, you hardly ever get an explanation about that. The second thing here is that in this trip to Cape Town, Biko is not even being said to be thinking about the PAC. Biko is going to talk to Neville Alexander about the ANC. Nothing is being said about what Biko is thinking, about the PAC, or whether in this discussion the PAC will actually enter the equation. That is not actually explained at all. But you are right, that by the time Biko goes to Cape Town in September 1977, discussions and discourses about the true state of the exiled formations, was something that was already, in the public domain. And that there is no doubt that Biko would have actually known about that. But the other thing that we have to bear in mind here is that by September 1977, already a formation of the Black consciousness movement is actually making its presence felt in exile. The student formation, which at this stage is assuming a kind of a national identity. It is no longer constituting itself as the Soweto Student Representative Council.
Yes.
It is now beginning to constitute itself as a South African student formation. But what is important is that it is beginning to create structures that are operating independently of the ANC and the PAC, in exile. Now that is important. That is something that Biko should have been exposed to, so that when he goes to Cape Town, it is known that Biko has got all of that background, with him, and that he would be able to engage in some meaningful exchanges with Neville, and the others. But what still stands up to this day is that, Biko went there to, a popular view is that he wanted to explore, the possibilities of joining the ANC.
All
That's
in the
the
name of
dominant
black solidarity.
explanation. Pardon?
All in the name of the sentiments of black solidarity.
All exactly, and this is actually being explained, as a particular trait of the Black consciousness movement. Black consciousness is about black unity, and therefore Biko would have been driven by the quest for black unity, and for him black unity would have actually meant uniting, the ANC and the PAC into a single formation. But all of this argument misses the point. Here, I've actually explained this. The student movement is in exile. The student movement is interacting with the ANC and the PAC. And the student movement is taking a decision not to be associated with either, because it sees, the limitations, the paralysis, that both of them had actually descended into. So yes, in that context, it therefore makes sense that Biko, armed with this knowledge, if he was, in the ways that we are explaining it, it would make sense for him to go to Cape Town and tell Neville that, all of these formations should actually come under the...
But don't you think, more to the point, I mean, if Biko had been aware of the Gang of Eight saga, 2 years earlier, and the fact that the expulsion of Makiwane and Co, they would have been there. If Biko had been aware of the Gang of Eight saga, the folly of this black solidarism would have been apparent to him.
Yes, in actual fact, that this is again. I mean, if we take the developments between 1975 and Biko's death in 1977, and this is what South Africans are unable to reflect on, and just to see, so many things being crammed in within a very short space of time. No doubt, the attitude of the ANC towards the black radical, tradition was actually articulated more, more robustly, as they would say, in 1975. The expulsion of the Gang of Eight was on no other account other than that they were black radicals. I mean, this is the reason why, Oliver Tambo, and it is, this is something also that's quite concerning. And, you and me often use the phrase, black as absence. If there's anything that illustrates, black as absence in the ANC, in the exiled ANC, for the duration of its exile period, is the ways in which the Gang of Eight was actually dealt with. It is Tambo and Dumanokwe who are being made the fall guys. It is them in the forefront of expelling the Gang of Eight. But the orchestration of the whole thing behind the scenes is something that is being done, and this has to be said. This was an agenda of non-Africans, particularly, well, with the exception of Dumanokwe, but it was particularly orchestrated by non-Africans inside the SACP, to try and sugarcoat the expulsion of the Gang of Eight in any other way, does not help at this stage. I think this is the time that we have to confront these issues. The Gang of Eight were expelled from the ANC in measures that were orchestrated by the non-Africans. Yusuf Dadoo was particularly instrumental in this, and Joe Slovo cannot be exonerated from it. So the two would actually have to take the blame. But yes, the expulsion of the Gang of Eight would have established the ANC's attitude to black radicalism. And no doubt, I mean, if Biko was going to try and talk the ANC into becoming a BCM, that was not going to actually happen. That again would have been an illustration of his naivete.
Yeah, but I doubt though that Biko was naive of what you're raising here. The likelier scenario is that he was going to Cape Town to do was to simply lay down the law.
Yeah, and say, come over.
Yes.
But what we need to do now, is to really work that kind of relationship. And this is not really, imagining the facts. The facts are there, right. That Biko had a very early, link to POQO and therefore to the PAC. There is no reason why that should not be substantiated and be explained as the basis for the emergence of black consciousness as a black radical tradition. But equally important for our viewers, let us understand, that, the very circumstances of its appearance, the black radical tradition, the very circumstances of its appearance required that it should be minimized, it should be misinterpreted, and that it should be, completely distorted, which is precisely what has happened to the black radical tradition until it was completely obliterated with Black Wednesday in October 1977. Having said that, I think part of what we need to, to make quite clear here is that in political terms, beyond October 1977, and we are here talking about, the 15-year period between 1978 and 1993, there is a very romanticized, celebrated, mass democratic movement, of that period. And it is a movement that is being, given the credit for having forced South Africa into the transition. It is the mass democratic movement that rendered the white supremacy state, ungovernable in that 15-year period. Now that is a kind of, a reflection on history that is, generally, accepted as historical fact. What is not, spoken about explicitly is that at no stage beyond Black Wednesday, at no stage beyond October 1977, was there a mass movement in South Africa that was actually a black radical mass movement. So even the mass movement of the 1980s, in the way it was constituted, it was a systematic assault on Biko's ideas. So this should bring us to, where the discourse about Biko is today. And perhaps, it will be useful to reflect on, maybe 2 or 3 presentations that are quite significant, in the commemoration of the Biko moment. And, 2 of these will be Professor Joel Raboto's presentation on the occasion of the Africa Day lecture at Stellenbosch University.
Joel Mudir, man.
Yes.
Or Joel Raboto.
No, Professor Joel Mudir's presentation.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Professor Joel Mudir's presentation
Yes.
at the Stellenbosch University, and this was on the occasion of Africa Day lecture, of an annual lecture that is hosted by the Stellenbosch University. I think we have covered quite clearly, Biko's last days and what he was actually attempting to do. We have given all the explanations, that has been given. If there's another thing, yes.
If one follows the implications of what you're attempting to do here,
yes.
Biko didn't have ideas of his own, if you will. Biko was merely articulating mass ideas, if you will, ideas widely proliferated within a collectivity, historically born ideas.
Historically born, which is why, and this is good. We'll say it again, and this is for the benefit of the viewers to understand, what this is. You are right to say this was not Biko's ideas. These ideas Biko would have articulated, but they were generated within the black experience, and this is the way we have to see these ideas. That explains why I have always said that it could have been Kwatema, it could have been it could have been Tsakani, it could have been Mohlakeng. But it is that black experience, that found fertile ground, in Soweto, which it could have found in Kwatema. The issue here is that, you are right, there had to be a crucible. The black collective that would act as a crucible would have to be there. And in this case, that crucible happened to be Soweto. It could have been any of those.
It was much less about the fact that Biko articulated what he articulated, but rather the resonance of what he articulated upon a collectivity. Yes,
with the masses, exactly.
Right. So,
exactly.
So to really latch upon a theme brought up by Professor Joel Mudir at his funeral, supposedly his mother, Biko's mother, had made the proclamation that in truth, harping upon his name, the meaning of his name, Bantu, that in truth he was not my child, he belonged to the nation. Yes. So really making the point here that what really matters is not the death of Biko, but rather that, Biko lived not so much in his individual being, in his biographical being, but Biko, more meaningful is Biko lived in us.
Exactly. Yes.
And that in the corollary, therefore, that it is his death in us rather than any biographical demise. That, you know what I'm saying, that ought to occupy center stage.
Yes. In fact, yes. I mean, hopefully that's going to be, coloring the discourse as we go forward. There's no doubt, we cannot be going on and repeating the same things that people have been saying in the past 50 years. It will be 50 years pretty soon. But these are new insights, if you like, into the life and times of Biko. And again, I mean, going back to Joel Mudir's presentation, his presentation was that, to date, there has been 3 deaths of Biko. The first death would have been the death that we are talking about. That happened on the 12th of September. That would have been Biko's, mortal demise, if you like. It happened on the 12th of September. But Professor Mudiri goes on to identify other moments in history when the death of Biko is being repeated. And the second one is in 1995, and this is in relation to a court approach, where the court ruled against Biko's family and Azapo. And the third of Biko's death, Professor
I think ruled
Mudiri,
against the clemency plea.
it was against the
something about the
TRC,
TRC.
and the forgiveness,
Yes.
kind of provision,
Right.
in the TRC Act. And the last is the state of South Africa today, that in and of itself, represents yet another death of Biko. But one may actually say that, all of these are arbitrarily chosen over the past 48 years since Biko died. There has been so many momentous, moments in history, each of which could, in and of themselves, have actually become an instantiation of yet another Biko death.
A point I've brought up to is that even the choice of words about Biko's death is somewhat misleading, and that Biko didn't merely give up the ghost of his own accord. The man was murdered.
Yes, yeah.
And the same could be said to the tradition that he belongs to.
To the tradition that he
didn't
belonged
just
to,
die.
yes, yes,
It
Yes,
it was
I agree.
a target
But
of
the point I
robust
was making
aggression,
is
yes.
that it could be said that, in the past 48 years, there were so many moments in history, each of which could be an instantiation of Biko death. Why the three? Are they arbitrarily chosen? Or is their significance far surpassing the rest?
The reality is that an authentically white supremacist order that holds blackness as a phobic object doesn't just kill blackness once. It is
it kills
necessary that it over and
yes,
over and
yes.
over and over again in
Yes,
order to
yes,
exist.
yes, yeah.
So this ought to be possibly the guiding
Yes.
metaphor here. Yes.
But if you go back to to the observation that there could have been many other moments in history that could be identified as yet another Biko death, that these three are arbitrarily chosen, or are they carrying such significance that they overshadow all others? I would say yes. There are so many moments in history that some would most definitely, overshadow the other two. The 1995 case and what is South Africa today. The one moment that we have always been yearning to talk about, and we will be talking about at some point, but this is an opportunity to isolate that moment and demonstrate what its impact would have been, on Biko's ideas. And that is the Makis Kosana moment. The Makis Kosana moment is so significant, as a moment in history when Biko died another death.
No, just wait up. So Biko died another death.
Yeah.
Yes. Died within us, if you will.
Yeah, within us another death, So the point here is that it can be argued that the mass movement in itself of the 1980s, in its character, was a systematic assault on what Biko stood for. If black on black violence was in fact, the central theme of the mass movement of the 1980s, black on black violence itself represents a systematic assault, on what Biko's thinking was. And that in itself could be seen as yet another, of Biko's deaths. But yes, Professor Mudiri decided, to choose those three. Another issue here, which we have to actually talk about is the fact that it is not only the white supremacy state, we've talked about how the white supremacy state started dealing with the black radical tradition, particularly, throughout 1977, maybe from 1976 when it erupted. But we begin to see, a kind of determination in the second half of 1977. And, this culminates in October 19, Black Wednesday. And the effect there is that the organizational infrastructure, of the black consciousness movement is completely obliterated. What that actually leads to is, in fact, a moment of political quiescence. Now, it becomes a political quiescence precisely because Soweto itself is quiescent. And in the popular consciousness, in the immediate aftermath of the Soweto uprising, when Soweto became quiescent, in the popular consciousness, South Africa is quiescent.
Not so.
But that may not be so.
No.
In actual fact, it wasn't so. Soweto was quiescent between 78 and 83, but there was unrest in other parts of Gauteng, that were going on. For instance, on the East Rand, there were major unrest, taking place on the East Rand. But because, people tended to think of unrest in relation to Soweto, that period 78 to 83 is considered, a period of quiescence. No, but this is also a period when the state actually responded, to the black radical tradition of the 1970s. There is, I think there is a recognition, of the fact that the white supremacy state actually adopted two ways of dealing with that, having dealt with Biko and having instituted Black Wednesday. They had to now find ways of dealing with the black radical tradition.
So in a word, having killed Biko the person, they had to kill Biko within
in all of us.
In all of us.
In
right.
all of us, yes.
Yeah, so this was the 1980s.
And that becomes the agenda of total strategy.
Yeah, so to be sure, it is not merely the agenda of the state structure and the conservatives and the verklamtes,
it is the
agenda of white society.
Of whiteness across the board. Across the board. Whiteness across the board coalesces.
Right.
And and they start systematically doing this.
So whiteness and the white is the whiteness and the white adjacent, if you will, the white adjacent strata of South African society.
Yes, but more importantly, while the state while the apartheid, this white supremacy state, it is understandable that it would react in those terms to the black radical tradition. What we need to talk about, is how the mass movement of the 1980s was also yet another weapon that was used against the black radical tradition. And this is where whiteness across the board actually comes into the equation. Because there seemed to be an understanding that in the popular violence of 1984 to 1993, the antagonisms were between, the state and the mass movement. But in actual fact, the most telling antagonism was within black society itself. And that in itself was a systematic assault, on the black radical tradition. But something else needs to be explained. If the black radical tradition and paradigm was taken out of the political equation in this period, 1978 to 1993, we concede that the struggle after 1978 was no longer framed in the same terms that black consciousness had framed the struggle in the 1970s. There was a paradigm shift that we need to explain. What justified the paradigm shift? What was the paradigm shift and what justified it? The paradigm shift was that in the 1970s, the struggle was framed as a struggle for black emancipation. That definition in itself excluded the participation of other races from this struggle because it was a struggle for black emancipation. What may be contested was in fact the definition of black, the wider definition of black that would have included, the colors and the Indians. My sense is that it is that wide definition of black that needs to be subjected to some serious review, in the light of what has actually happened in the past 48 years. But the issue here is that defining the struggle as the struggle for black emancipation, that in itself excluded white participation from the struggle, precisely because there is no way whites could have participated in a struggle for black emancipation. And that was the understanding, of the struggle until Black Wednesday. And Black Wednesday put an end to that. From then onwards, the struggle was no longer a struggle for black emancipation. New labels were emerging, new labels that were beginning to validate certain forms, certain forms of struggle, deliberately intended to obfuscate rather than, to clarify, the antagonisms. And the issue here has to be understood. All of these other labels were being adopted. The idea was, again, this is a distortion, this is a misinterpretation of the black radical tradition. While people are still claiming that this is a struggle for black people, the labels that are being given to this are meant to actually downplay and underrepresent, what the struggle for black emancipation was about. So I don't know if people realize or the viewers realize that up until 1977, our struggle was a struggle for black emancipation. Thereafter, younger people are growing up when the struggle is an anti-apartheid struggle. But what is that? That has to be seen as a kind of linguistic reframing of what the liberation struggle was about. And what is the purpose? The purpose, yet again, it is to deal thoroughly with the black radical tradition. And what does the struggle become? It becomes an anti-apartheid struggle. And that waters it down completely. When a struggle becomes an anti-apartheid struggle, white people are welcomed. In actual fact, an anti-apartheid struggle is an initiative of white people. White people came up with the idea of actually setting up an organization in London. I'm terribly uncomfortable about this, but Makiwane was part of...
Specifically English-speaking whites.
Specifically English-speaking ones in England. And some of them were South African expatriates living in England.
Most of them, isn't it?
Most of them would have been, yes. And what bothers me is that at the beginning, Makiwane would have been one of them, but much later Makiwane becomes, something to be celebrated. But that is what the anti-apartheid, struggle is. It is a struggle of white people. It is the struggle of the Labour Party in England, pledging solidarity with oppressed black people in South Africa. It is the struggle of NGOs in the US, non-governmental organizations in the US.
Scandinavia.
They were engaging in anti-apartheid
Scandinavia.
Yeah?
Scandinavia.
In the Scandinavian countries, for sure. And all of these were funding the anti-apartheid struggle. But in all of this, it was understood that all of this was done to prop up the ANC in exile, not the PAC. The PAC was completely excluded, from this kind of social stroke political club, that would be under the banner of anti-apartheid movement. Now, throughout the 1960s, the anti-apartheid movement would then have been active into the 1970s, but that would have been outside South Africa.
The reality is that the PAC was still operating under the shadow of its POQO saga, of the POQO
Yes, if it
uprising.
was operating at all, and against, again with that, we are going to have to be very frank about what ultimately happens, But then into the 70s, and this is where the anti-apartheid label then enters the political discourse inside South Africa. Up until then, anti-apartheid was a preoccupation of those in Europe and probably in the US. But when the disinvestment campaign is undertaken and Archbishop Desmond Tutu gets to be in the forefront of it, this is when those linguistic forms begin to enter the South African political discourse. In the UK, the disinvestment campaign is in fact supported very heavily by the anti-apartheid movement, and it is that kind of language that is made to filter through, and begin to define what the struggle of the 1980s was about. So at a popular level, the mass democratic movement of the 1980s was an anti-apartheid movement in the same way as the British Labour Party was an anti-apartheid movement. But that was actually, a very successful, kind of maneuver, to influence the black masses, away from the black radical tradition into a new tradition that was also defined as radical and yet not as black. And we have to really explain to the viewers, how this is actually being done at different levels. On the one level, it is being done within academia, within South African academia. And this happens in the universities. And the structures that are being created in the universities, in the 1980s are going to, be constructed in such a way that within the universities they are going to be, effecting this paradigm shift from the student movement of the 1970s, which was inspired by the black radical tradition of the black consciousness movement, into a completely different paradigm that is in fact guided by the Freedom Charter. So what we are actually seeing here is that, the black radical expressions of the 1970s are being replaced by the Freedom Charter. So the mass movement becomes a mass movement that is united, under the Freedom Charter. But this is where it becomes particularly interesting. What is the reaction of the state to the emergence of images, of the Freedom Charter and the ANC as early as 1980? Quite interestingly, the white supremacy state allows these symbols, to enter and penetrate political discourse and political symbolism. And where does this happen first? Quite interestingly, it happens at the funeral of Griffiths Mxenge, at his burial. His coffin is covered in an ANC flag. And that is when, the new tradition, begins to penetrate the political discourse, and the political symbolisms, that begin to emerge. So what we are seeing there is that sort of a paradigm shift. But what we are not talking about, is that this is an alliance of the white supremacy state, in whose interest it is to contain the black radical tradition. But it is also in the interest of white society across the board. But we need to single out a particular segment of white society that begins to play a critical and active role in effecting this transition from the black radical paradigm, inspiring the mass movement of the 70s, to the Freedom Charter, becoming the, the document of choice in the 1980s. And that particular segment of white society would be white academics of the left tradition. And people may not understand how
The Martin Legassics,
the Martin
Schiller Marx,
Legacy, we call them the white left. Pardon?
the revisionists.
Yeah, in historical terms, we call them and people may not understand how they actually get linked to the mass movement of the 80s, and we need to explain this. This happens around the same time when historically white universities open their doors to black students. And once that happens, these universities are beginning to have access to black communities through black students who are now, becoming students in those universities. And this happens particularly after 1984. But what is happening here is that in the universities, and here we may be talking about VETs, the Freedom Charter is beginning to be centered, as the doctrine of choice. And that actually displaces the black radical tradition. It is unfortunate that we don't see any political activism at all in black universities during this period. The University of the North and Ngoye and the University of Fort Hare at any time between 78 and 83 are actually throttled, by white supremacist security infrastructure running just about everything, in these universities. So there's a great deal of repression. At the University of Zululand, you don't even have an SRC. So it was that sort of situation. But at the same time, the focus is beginning to shift to white universities that are opening their doors to black students. And this is where the revisionist academics, the white academics of the left, are now beginning to teach the new paradigm. And that new paradigm is a Marxist-Leninist paradigm. What does that actually mean in real terms? What does it mean when, that paradigm is supposed to be played out in real life and real time situations, such as on the 3rd of September in the Vaal, when the unrest broke out. Again, this is an eruption of the new struggle, but this new struggle is about something else. And viewers have to understand how, the universities would play a role in defining the struggle at this time. Because
But more damning is your insinuation here that this was quote unquote allowed. You know what I'm saying? That the national security, the repressive national security state, had, gave its tacit, okay, if you will, to move it. So at the same time that there was this stark repression in black universities,
yes,
there was this political ferment that somehow was out of, off the radar of the securocrats in predominantly white universities, or white controlled.
When we talked about this with your friend some time ago, he got a sense that what we are talking about is a kind of mass movement that was vetoed, that was vetoed by the white supremacy state. Yes, it was. It was precisely because, it was helping along, to stifle the black radical tradition. And that is what we need to, to really focus on. But the problem that I wanted to bring...
And sanctioned rather than veto.
Yeah. Well, sanctioned, yes, but, it actually allowed it.
Yeah, that wouldn't be the veto.
But allowed it, but the issue here is that there had to be an explanation of the most important aspect here. Who is the enemy? And that became problematic.
But then the contrast between the SSL, the Soweto Student League, how that was treated, and COSAS, isn't it?
Yes,
isn't that salient in this regard?
Okay, maybe that's...
what was the time frame between those?
Yeah, well, the time lapse here would have been barely a year. I mean,
Wow.
the Soweto Student League...
And it's like night and day.
Yeah, barely
in terms
lasted
of the
a year.
response.
By
Right.
the time it was established, there was a definite crackdown on it. And not even a year later, COSAS was established.
And nothing like that
and
ever
nothing
comes
happened.
in.
It was
Right.
allowed
Right.
to actually to continue, and COSAS continued. It's still there to this day. It hasn't.
Right.
It still exists.
Right.
And yeah, that was the one way. That was the one way of actually dealing with the black radical tradition of the 1970s. But the one issue that hasn't been dealt with, is that in a mass movement like that, there has to be a clear understanding, of the protagonists. Who is the enemy and who was the enemy in this. That required an explanation of what the struggle was about. In the 1970s, the struggle was for black emancipation. But because the struggle is no longer about black emancipation, who then actually becomes the enemy? And I think this is where the difficulty is. And a lot of people are finding it difficult to explain, the philosophical underpinnings, of the mass movement of the 1970s. And what were these philosophical underpinnings? It was Marxism, Leninism. And therefore the mass movement of the 1970s, in the ultimate end, were involved in the struggle for a socialist dispensation. And therefore defining the enemy here required an academic exercise. And this is where the universities came into the picture. The universities had to explain to the black students that the struggle in South Africa is not a struggle for black emancipation.
It wasn't phenomenological in the sense it wasn't directly, it didn't emanate from the direct experiences of the collectivity. It was a technical insight requiring specialists for access.
It was a kind of, you may say, external intervention.
Right.
Which is why when one says the mass movement of the 1980s had as its think tank the white radical left, it appears that one is undermining black people's capabilities to do certain things, but that is what it was. The issue here is that there had to be an understanding. If the struggle was not going to be about black liberation, black emancipation, what then was it about? And it was about capitalism. And this is where the issue of racial capitalism, enters the equation. This is problematic. It becomes problematic in that one would have to really, absorb all of this as an academic exercise, as something that you do in the lecture theaters. And this is what I'm able to say this because I was actually subjected to this kind of tuition, where you had to learn, that this situation in South Africa is all about the political economy you food. It's not about race, it's about the political economy. And there's the primary contradiction and there's the secondary contradiction. And race is a secondary contradiction, class is but you have to be able to translate this into Soweto, into the contestation over the rent issue, the contestation over the evictions that were taking place back in the day, contestations over whether you should get free electricity or not, which is what the contestations were about. But there was a clever way of doing it, of still being able to be consistent, with the Marxist Leninist doctrine, and still be able to deal with, the conflicts in the township. And how was this being done? This was being done by a very, robust and very detailed characterization of the state, because here we are looking for the enemy. Now the state becomes the enemy, and the state becomes an enemy in ways that cannot be disputed. Indisputably, the state is an enemy. So what do you have to look for? you have to look for the representatives of this enemy, the state, in the townships. And where do you find them? It is the next councillor. He becomes the representative of the state. So Kuzayo Dlamini, on the 3rd of September 1984, he appears and he becomes the face of the white supremacist state, and he gets brutally murdered in the streets of Sebokeng, of Shabwe. Very brutally murdered very early in the morning. Now that being the first instance of the mass movement of the mass democratic movement of the 80s, was another for people who had the experience of the black radical movement of the 70s. Looking at that particular moment, for them it was yet another moment of death of Biko, because others were still to happen. That was the first, and the impact it had on the ways in which the black radical tradition is being attacked was unimaginable. Let me explain what I mean by this. Kuzayo was a deputy mayor of Shabwe, so that made him a councillor, a representative of the state. We had the same situation hardly 7 years before, in 1977. But that was the black radical mass movement of the 70s, inspired by the black consciousness tradition. We had the same situation where we had to deal with the councillors, and the councillors were members of the Urban Bantu Council, a local government structure created by the apartheid state. And in August 1977, we came to the conclusion that they have to go. What we did was, because they were parents, we went to them, we wrote a resignation letter for them, and they signed it, and they stepped down, and they dissolved the Urban Bantu Council. Why? Because they were black, and they were our parents. And I always say that the injunction that comes out of the mass movement of the 70s, don't kill a black man for any political objective. If you have to, that objective is not worth pursuing. But the very first thing that the mass movement of the 1980s does is to brutally murder Kuzayo Dlamini. And that.
But you see, at a conceptual level, it has abstracted the state from white society, at least at the
Yes, it does abstract the state from white society.
So that white society goes away scot-free,
yes.
And all our
yes, but where does this become particularly evident? When a black policeman has to be liquidated, he gets liquidated. But no white policeman gets liquidated, yes. While the white policeman is also the face of the state. But then why is it that it would be the black policeman who gets liquidated? Because he is the low-hanging fruit. That's the low-hanging fruit of the apartheid state.
But in any case, the overall objective is to veer away violence from white society.
Yes.
To preserve white society for us and defend the radical aspect of the black movement. That's the first thing to do once you arrive as a white radical, quote unquote.
You use the right term, to defend the black radical.
The first order of business, yes, before they do anything else, right?
Yeah, okay. So I think what people need to take away, from this would be the following. That if we have, succeeded, well and good, but we hope we have succeeded in proving that Steve Biko was a child of the 50s and 60s, and that his thinking was actually rooted in that period. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is a great deal of hesitation in linking Biko to the POQO movement, and this has to do with the fact that POQO in history is known for its brutality against white people. And that is something that would make black radicals uncomfortable. But the reality here is that that is what POQO was. And there is no doubt, in fact, the fact that Steve was taken into custody in itself does suggest that there was certainly a kind of...
POQO was a reaction to the unqualified and gratuitous violence of white society against the black.
As seen in Sharpeville.
Right.
As seen in Sharpeville.
Yes.
POQO was a reaction to that.
Yes.
But finally, and the one thing that has to be understood too, is that POQO comes out of that tradition, where the struggle was the struggle for the right to territory.
Yes.
It wasn't, a right to vote or, civil rights or anything else. The mass movement of the 1920s and 30s was a mass movement that was struggling for the right to territory. And this is taken in the 1950s by the PAC. And there is no doubt that it is again taken, in the 1970s by the Black Consciousness Movement. So what we are going to be talking about in future is the fact that, the 60 years between 1918 and 1977, can be, reflected upon as the 60 years of the Black radical tradition. The fact that we are unable to even talk about it intelligibly today is precisely because of, the amount of money, investments, both in intellectual, material, and other terms. Investments from the US as well. The Ford Foundation, plowed so much money into South African universities to teach the white left paradigm.
To colonize black history and black memory.
And colonize black history for sure.
And black memory.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. To obliterate black memory. The Ford Foundation spent huge amounts of money in doing that.
Indeed.
That has been the fate of the black radical tradition. Yeah.
There we go.
Good,
Thank you.